Up to John, the 8th chapter in the Gospel of John. It's just like there's classic passage after classic passage after classic passage. And this is another one of those classic passages. We just in way of introduction, we're going to hit some of the I am tonight. And that should ring a bell. When Jesus says I am, it's not just a statement. He's making more than simply a statement. What does this phrase "I am" mean when Jesus uses it?
God.
Yeah, and how do we know it refers to the fact that he is not just the Son of God but equal with God, a claim for divinity? How do we know that?
So there's a burning bush.
Okay, but what happened at the burning bush? That's Exodus. Which chapter is it?
Yeah.
That's right, chapter 3. What happens at the burning bush in Exodus, the 3rd chapter?
Ask him what name.
Yeah, like what name should I call you by?
Yeah, one of the many things that Moses asked is, if they ask me what your name is, what should I say? And God's answer is,
I am.
oh, that was pretty good. Not real easy to translate, but as best we can translate it is, I am. And in the Greek, he uses the same phrase that would have been translated in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, for the name of God. But it's not just that. I mean, it is that. And the way he uses it, which, by the way, how do we know that the people understood him to be using it that way? Because they got really mad. How mad they get? Wanted to kill him because they said, that's blasphemy, you're claiming to be God. So they understood what he was saying. By the way, in case I forget to say it later, when Jesus does that, and he's going to do it again in the 8th chapter, and they say, hey, you're claiming to be God, and they pick up stones to stone him, Jesus doesn't say, oh no, that's not what I meant, you misunderstood. No, it's kind of like, yeah, you got it, good. That is what he means. Okay, so just on the surface, just knowing that, it is God's name. But in addition to that, especially in the context tonight, when somebody asks you where you were born and your response to that is saying, I am, so even if it wasn't the name of God, what kind of response is that?
Implies that you've always existed.
Yeah, it's a response saying, I wasn't born, I've always been. I've always been. So even if it wasn't the name of God, it would still be a claim for divinity. So at two different levels, as we read through in the English language, it's one of those things that's easy to blow right by. But the Jews got it, and especially when you look at it through biblical lenses, considering the rest of what the Bible says, comes through very clear. Well, there are 7 major times in the book of John where he makes statements about, I am the bread of life. And tonight we're going to get into a little bit more of this. Which chapter did he say, I am the bread of life?
6.
That'd be chapter 6. That's right, in the feeding of the 5,000. And the idea of bread sustaining life, it helps us better understand Jesus' purpose for coming. 7 major times, 7 major ways Jesus says that. But just in chapter 8, in addition to these other times that he says, I am the bread of life, or the light of the world, or the gate for the sheep, or the good shepherd. In addition to that, sometimes he just says, I am. And we're going to look at the context tonight, 3 different times that he says that, because it is going to be significant. So I just want to make this point. It's not an exception. It is common for Jesus to say that. Now, we'll get to that after this first set of verses. Last week when we finished off, we took special attention the fact that in most of our translations there's a footnote by these verses in the first several verses of chapter 8, right? What do your Bibles say for the very last verse of chapter 7, which would be verse 53 all the way down through verse 11 of chapter 8?
Earliest manuscripts do not include these.
Right. So I think the one word of caution here is we don't want to hang our hats on any teaching that's only found in a passage like this. There are a few passages in the New Testament where we're not 100% confident, but we know where those passages are. So, I don't know where I originally heard this, but I really like this saying. We are 100% sure about 99.9% of the New Testament. And I like saying it that way because there are a couple passages like this one and the other big one. Where's the other big one? Yeah, the last part of the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. There's also like one verse in Mark chapter 7. There's a verse in 1 John chapter 5. The one in 1 John chapter 5 is really interesting because we know how that one got messed up. It got messed up by a guy named Desiderius Erasmus. Does Erasmus' name sound familiar to anybody? Erasmus is the very first guy to put together a Greek text. What is a Greek text? A Greek text is where you take all the available manuscripts and you bring them together of the Greek language. And so when people like the NIV or anybody else, they use a Greek text today called the Nestle Island text. Nestle Island text takes 7,000 manuscripts. And they have a bunch of people, full-time staff, that are all the time examining all the evidence, and they're putting it in. And so the Nestle Island, last time I looked, it had like 28 updates. So they're all the time looking at all this stuff, and they're what they do. If you ever had a copy of a Greek New Testament, you'll have a Greek New Testament, and all the way through it has all these little letters. And you look at the bottom for the footnotes, and all these little letters, they call it weighing. And what that says is, here are the manuscripts that have this reading. So you can look through, and we know that of the 7,000 manuscripts out there, all of them are in agreement on almost everything. But the places where they're not, we know where those places are. Well, that place in 1 John chapter 5, where it says these three are in agreement. Do you remember that passage in 1 John chapter 5? We know what happened there because this guy named Desiderius Erasmus, who put together the very first Greek text, he did so when there was only 3 Greek manuscripts available. We have 7,000 today, approximately. I'm rounding off, right? About 7,000 Greek manuscripts today. He had 3. The problem was he got to a verse in 1 John, the 5th chapter, where all 3 of his manuscripts didn't have anything. So what are you going to do? Because everybody was using, you know what everybody's Bible they used through most of the Dark Ages? You know what the Bible of the church was through the Dark Ages? It was the Latin Vulgate. That's exactly right, Latin Vulgate. And the Latin Vulgate had a verse there, and his 3 Greek manuscripts didn't. So you know what he did? He translated from Latin back into Greek and put it in the Greek text. So that's why if you're ever reading through 1 John chapter 5, there'll be one verse there, and it's really only half a verse, and you're going to have a footnote that says, most ancient reliable manuscripts don't have this. You could actually read, no good reliable manuscripts have this. This came out of the Latin. So anyway, I just wanted to say that our Bibles today, most Bibles, you've got good footnotes in them. Please don't pay attention to the study Bibles where people write commentary. That's just man. What I'm talking about with these footnotes is when it says either the Greek has it or it doesn't. Right? Okay, so having said all that, probably took way too much time on that, but here's this first story, very, very famous story. Verse 1, Jesus went up to the Mount of Oliver. Isn't that? No, sorry. Mount of Olives. I just overheard a conversation. Sorry. It went up to the Mount of Olives at dawn. He appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him. By the way, what time of day is this? Dawn. Very good. I'm glad you're following along. Everybody gathered around him and he sat down to teach, and the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to push this too far, but I do want to make sure we get this. Caught in the very act of adultery. Okay, so something's going on that shouldn't be going on, and you picture this, they rip the woman right out of the bedroom, and they bring her to Jesus. Okay, what's the first thing you think when you think, okay, they ripped this woman out of the bedroom and bring her to Jesus?
Where's the guy?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, it takes 2 to commit this sin of adultery, right? They only bring the woman. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? By the way, what did the Bible command them to do? To stone the people who committed adultery, not just the women. Not just the women. I do sense a little bit of prejudice here. But anyway, to stone such a woman. Now, what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order that they might have a basis for accusations. This is called the horns of a dilemma. Have you heard that before? Where you back somebody in a corner, and the idea is if you can picture a bull with the great big long horns, and they capture somebody in a corner. The reason they call this argument the horns of a dilemma is you've got two major choices here. If I go this way, I get stabbed with a horn. If I go this way, I get stabbed with a horn. Okay, what are his two major choices here? If there's somebody caught in the act of adultery, what are you supposed to do according to the law? Stone him. Okay, if he went that route, what's the horn that he's going to get caught up on? What? Oh, okay. That's going to be part of the problem. That's exactly right, because it's not consistent here. But if he were to do that, where's his major problem going to be? Because in that day, most people don't care so much about the man; they care about the woman. But where's the problem going to be? Well, let me go the other way first. If Jesus doesn't do anything to this woman, what's the horn that he's going to be stabbed with? You're not upholding the law, and you say you're from God, and this is God's law, and this is very clearly taught in the Scripture, right? So you're going to get stabbed on that one. But if you do, the major one he's going to get hung up on it is, remember when Jesus is finally taken through the trial and crucified? How did that go? How many trials did he go through? He wasn't just at the high priest's house, which, by the way, was illegal because this took place in the middle of the night and it shouldn't have even happened. Not only did they shuffle him back and forth from the Sanhedrin as well as the chief priest's house, but where did they eventually take him?
Oh yeah, to Herod. Roman.
They took him. Why did they take him to Pilate? Why? And I know Pilate shipped him off to Herod and back, but why get the governing authorities involved?
They couldn't kill him.
We find out at that point that it's illegal for them to carry out the death sentence. The Romans have to do this. So if he does it, he's in trouble. What's that saying? In trouble if you do, in trouble if you don't. Don't say it any other way. We'll just leave it like that. Okay. One horn is if he doesn't say anything, then you're not fulfilling the law. But if he does say, okay, let's pick up stones, let's stone this woman, then he's in trouble with the Romans, right? Okay. By the way, that's just one possible explanation. There could be a whole lot of other problems for him if he picks up stones and starts telling everybody to go ahead and stone this woman. But that's a major one. So it seems like there's no way for him to turn. We know that they're trying to capture him because in verse 6 it says this question was a trap. Well, even if you didn't have that, what time of day is this? This is first thing in the morning. These religious leaders are getting up at the break of dawn. Why? Because they want to capture Jesus, right? And so it's like they're just looking for this opportunity. So here's what happens. Still in verse 6 it says, but Jesus bent down and started to write in the ground with his finger. Okay, this verse is a classic verse in so many different ways. I can actually remember two different sermons I've heard where the whole sermon was what Jesus wrote in the dirt. You've heard sermons like this before, haven't you? Okay, what's the problem with a sermon like that?
I didn't see where it said it.
We don't know what he wrote in the dirt. And, I'll just go ahead and tell you, one of the sermons was by this preacher. He's kind of rusty guy. His name's Billy Graham. Have you ever heard of this guy? Preached a whole sermon on what Jesus wrote in the sand. And I'm like, really? Billy, haven't you been around a while? Anyway, sorry. Why does it mention that he bent down and wrote in the sand? Okay, again, I don't want to speculate on what it doesn't say. I just find it significant that they bring this charge to him, and instead of Jesus saying, well, I got to do this or this, what does he do? He bends down and writes this. By the way, of all the suggestions, the one that I think is probably the best is, a lot of people think he's probably writing the sins of a whole bunch of people. It probably was significant that he's writing, right, and they're watching what he writes. But what I really like about this is, have you ever heard this saying, poor planning on your part doesn't constitute an emergency on my part? You ever heard that saying? Love that saying. Because all the time people make some stupid mistakes or some poor planning and they come to you and say, we gotta do something. And it's kind of like, no, I don't. that's your problem. If I decide to act, that'd be a gracious thing for me to do. But the panic here is because you didn't plan well, right? Okay, well, why am I bringing that up? Because they're trying to force Jesus in a corner. And I think one of the first things Jesus is doing is, you don't have to force me anywhere. I don't even have to respond to you guys. He's just kind of, he does choose to respond to him, but you know what? I don't have to play your games. I don't have to get involved in this, which, by the way, I love this idea. So many times we allow atheists and people of non-belief to back us in corners. We don't have to get in. We just don't have to, yes.
Also, by hesitating, it's not, he's going, oh, they're starting to think, he's not doing what we thought he was doing. And they start thinking, maybe
Yes.
there's something else, and maybe they're reflecting on, maybe what I'm doing is wrong.
Yes.
Gives them time to, say, oh yeah, it follows exactly what we do. And it's like,
You know what, Willie? I
blessing
think you're
your own-
exactly right, because we're going to see in just a few verses how they are going to contemplate, and they're going to break off one by one, the older people first. Okay, and so there is going to be some time for reflection. Nonetheless, he stops and he writes. By the way, somebody else made a point. It doesn't just mention that he writes, it says he writes with his finger. And I do find that interesting because there are many references to the finger of God. And the references in the Bible to the finger of God is this idea of God coming into this world. And there is a sense in which, we're going to see a God answer here, because from our perspective, it's in trouble if you do, in trouble if you don't. It doesn't seem like there's any way out, but Jesus always has a way out because he's God. Right? Okay, anyway, verse 7, when they kept on questioning him. What does that tell you? It tells you he probably was writing in the dirt for a little while. Right? And they have to force the issue. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and he said to them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Then he stooped down and he wrote on the ground. So it's kind of like, okay, I will give you an answer. He's not done dealing with the whole thing, but he does straighten up and he tells them one thing. And what's the one thing he tells them? He says, if anybody here is without sin, let him cast the first stone. Okay, this is a classic response. Let's make sure we understand this. What does it mean to be without sin?
Perfect.
Okay, it does mean to be perfect. In this context, though, what does it mean to be without sin?
That you followed every law. So
Okay,
concentrate on the law.
I really agree with you. If following the law, being perfect and stuff like that.
Perfect judge of the
Haven't
situation.
committed adultery.
If you okay, what is required by the law? Let's look at this a little more thoroughly. They say our law requires that the person like this be stoned. Okay, let's follow that law. What does the law say? The law says in order for somebody to be stoned, there has to be witnesses, right? And so for this to be taken place appropriately according to the law, a witness needs to stand for it. Okay, now let's stop and think about this. I know there's other possibilities, but in all likelihood, who's the best witness for this woman having inappropriate sexual activity? Maybe the guy who is having inappropriate sexual activity with her. If not that, then maybe some people who were... What was this? This was a test, right? It was purposefully orchestrated to try to capture Jesus. So there's definitely the possibility that maybe some of these religious leaders actually orchestrated this. Okay, or here's another possibility. So it's either the man involved, orchestration of something that's against the law, or if somebody was just watching.
That's not okay either.
Are you innocent if you're just watching? No. If you were just watching, what should you have done? If you knew there was something wrong here, you should have said, whoa, wait a minute, why are you going in that bedroom in the first place? Right? So somebody who knowingly allowed something like this to happen, just about any way you look at this, I mean, there's several possibilities, but so many ways you look at this, you're saying, well, you know what, it's not just the lady who committed a sin here, there's potential of a lot of people committing sins. Jesus, on so many different occasions, can look around his audience and know what they're thinking. He knows what's going on. He's God. He knows everything. So he knows. So he says this. When he says this, the response would be, okay, hey, I'm a witness. Well, then you're also confessing to the fact that you're a sinner, right, in this case. So you can't be a witness against her without condemning yourself at the same time. Okay, just an excellent answer to this whole issue. So, after he says that, he stoops down again and writes to the ground. Verse 9, at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones first. Why do you think John points that out? Well, he probably points it out because it's true. Because the older ones left first. But why do you think older people are leaving first? Why do you think they're catching on quicker?
Not as that strong.
Maybe not as headstrong. Yeah, sometimes you get so emotional you can't think clearly, right? But the older ones, maybe a little bit wiser. Maybe people who can think. I remember so well having the privilege. I've had the privilege of working with a lot of good men as elders through the years. But there was this guy up north who was the CEO of this huge company, and for, I don't know, about 6 months he served as I came into a church where he was an elder, and then he went off. But for that short period of time, and the one thing that so impressed me about this guy, he was a good, godly man. And I've had the privilege of working with a lot of good, godly men. But the one unique thing about this guy was he was all the time would make comments about, well, this is going to happen. And I'm like, where in the world did that come from? And about a month later, it's like, he was right. He could see the implication of that and what it was going to lead to there and what it was going to lead to there. And I had to experience a few more things before I saw the guy was right. He knew where this stuff was going. And it just makes me think wisdom that comes with age makes you think, okay, we could fight this point, but you know what? It's a losing battle. We might as well just put the stones down now and just go away, right? And so the older ones first are leaving, and they left the woman standing there. Verse 10, I love this story because it's not just the way Jesus deals with the men who are not being fair, trying to trap Jesus, but the way he responds to this woman. Jesus straightened up and he asked her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you. I love this response. Neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. He did not say what you did was okay. Did not say that. He's also the only one, it's often been pointed out, he's the only one who could have picked up the stones and rightfully stoned her. Had no problem doing it. Because Jesus knows all things and he knows her guilt. So he doesn't say it's okay. He doesn't say what you did wasn't wrong. He just says, I'm not going to condemn you. Exact same thing he says to us. Exact same things he says to us. But he also puts out the challenge. It's not just that you're not going to have to pay the price for your sin. Jesus is going to let you off the hook. But also the challenge is, leave your life sin, go and sin no more. Go and sin no more. Okay, that's the section of Scripture that's not in a lot of the earliest and most reliable manuscripts. By the way, just another footnote here. When we talk about the most reliable manuscripts, which family of manuscripts are we usually talking about? The Alexandrian manuscripts, that's exactly right. They're not the largest family. We group the manuscripts through different times into 3, sometimes 4 families of manuscripts. They're general areas or periods of time. But Alexandria would represent what geographical area?
Egypt.
Northern Egypt, that's exactly right. And those, they're not the most numerous, but they are some of the oldest and most accurate as far as when you see, when you talk about, they call them variants. When they talk about variants or differences between manuscripts, if you ever see numbers, don't let them scare you, because almost all the variants are spelling errors. A lot of times that's hard to detect. Well, you get almost 0 in the Alexandrian text, but that's a good reason to question this whole passage. Okay, so that's the first 11 verses. Verse 12, it says, then Jesus spoke again to the people and said, I am, and that's where we get back to what we started off with tonight, I am the light of the world. Okay, if there's another way that Jesus is declaring his divinity, being God, Why would he say the light of the world? What's conveyed with bread of life? Why does he keep saying you've got to eat my flesh and drink my blood? What's that metaphor? What does that mean? What does food do for you? It sustains you, keeps you alive physically. What's going to give you spiritual life? Jesus says. Okay, spiritual life through Jesus. What's light do for us?
Keeps us from getting off the path.
Yeah, helps you see where you're going. You turn off the lights, and if it's dark enough, you're going to have real problems getting out of here, right? Seeing where to go. So it's not just sustaining life, it's also guiding us. So this idea of helping us to see God's truth and understand what's truth and understand what we need to know. That's part of the, I think, what Jesus is saying here when he says, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk, in fact, carries through this idea. You're not going to walk in darkness. To walk in darkness, by the way, this is not just a metaphor that Jesus uses. It's not just one John uses. You find it all the way through the Bible. All the way through the Bible, the idea of light versus darkness. Anyway, he says we'll never walk in darkness, but we'll have the light of life. Verse 13, the Pharisees challenged him. Here you are, appearing as your own witness. Your testimony is not valid. Doesn't this sound like chapter 5? Chapter 5 is the chapter where Jesus talks about, he gives his own testimony, but it's not just his own testimony. The Father also verifies. In fact, he goes through about 5 different pieces of evidence. He says, it's not just me, it's the Father, it's fulfillment of Scripture, it's the miracles, it's Moses. He's going to end up with Abraham this time. Back in chapter 5, he ends up with Moses. He says, you guys love Moses? If you really listen to Moses, you'd be listening to me. So he goes that path. This same basic outline in this section as far as answering the charges, but he presents it in a different way, and I love this. They come up and they challenge him, and they said, if you appear as your own witness, your testimony is not valid. And Jesus answered, even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid, for I know where I come from and I know where I am going. By the way, why would he bring up where I come from and where I'm going?
I don't know where you're from.
Okay, do you remember when the crowds, he comes back to Jerusalem and the crowds kept saying, well, nobody knows where he's from. And then the very next breath, what does somebody else in the crowd say? Well, he's from Galilee, so we know he can't be. Well, wait a minute, somebody else said we didn't know where he's from. Okay, so he knows there's a lot of confusion. And the very fact, if we could tie our minds back to chapter 7 and what he's going to say here, the very fact that Jesus keeps bringing this back up. If you're really trying to find out the truth and you hear a bunch of discrepancies and Jesus keeps bringing it back up and you really want to know the truth, what are you going to do? I'm going to dig a little bit more. If Jesus keeps bringing up this idea, do you really know where I'm from? I think I'd say, I think I need to go do some more homework on that, right? If you're really a seeker. Okay, so he's going to challenge that issue, but I want to bring something up here. Back in chapter 5, he did say, you know what, if I were the only one testifying, that wouldn't be enough. Now, why does he say that? And why do they bring this up here? Because according to the Old Testament law, what does it say? Right. By the way, is that idea repeated in the New Testament? Go ahead and shake your heads like this. Yeah, it is. And who's it talking about when it talks about you got to have at least 2 witnesses? Willie, who's it talking about? Greg, who's it talking about?
The elders.
Elders. That's exactly right. And why do you need 2 witnesses when you're talking about the elders?
Evidence.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In other words, you shouldn't listen to anything bad said about the elders. Right? Unless you have at least 2 witnesses. So the concept is repeated in the New Testament. Anyway, Jesus says that back in chapter 5, but notice what he says here in chapter 8. He's not going to disagree with the fact that you need to have more than 1 witness, and he's going to point that out in just a minute. But before he gets there, he wants to say something. He wants to clarify something. What is it? In verse 14, even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid. Okay, here's the point he's making. He knows what the law says. You've got to have more than 1 witness. And I'm going to get there in just a minute. But don't make the law say something it never said. And the conclusion they're coming to is, if you don't have 1 witness, more than 1 witness, then the 1 witness is false. In the Bible, the law never says that. It says you need more than one witness to establish the truth. But it doesn't say if there's only one witness, that means they're lying. Okay, why is Mark making such a point about this? We have this other class that the MiDA students are doing, and it's we're talking about faith and reason. Faith and reason. We're using this. We're using a book written by a guy named Dr. Nash, and it's called Faith and Reason. Excellent little book. It's been around for a while. He talks about a point, though, that I appreciate so much. The basic premise of this book fits so well with what we're talking about here since chapter 5. Chapter 5, chapter 7, and chapter 8 just fits so well with the whole idea of this book, and that's this. Everybody who's ever lived, who's ever had a mind, has a worldview. People may not call it a worldview, and they may not realize it's a worldview, but everybody has a worldview. What's a worldview? The worldview is the way you make sense out of what you know. Everybody has pieces of information, but it's kind of like the glasses you put on, the lens through which you look to make sense of things in life. Okay, Jesus in these passages is doing the very thing that we're trying to do in this other class, and that's this. If you have a faulty worldview, if the way you look at life and look at information is skewed, then how are you ever going to come to the truth? Christianity is not just true, it is the greatest worldview. And one of the best things we can do for people in the process of helping them come to Christianity is challenging them to examine their worldview. How do you look at life? How do you look at truth? And if it's inconsistent, don't you think you ought to find a better way to think? Keep that in the back of your mind as we go through what we're going to be looking here. When Jesus challenges the religious leaders, what he's really challenging them to do is, your thinking is inconsistent here. Let's think logically. That's basically what Jesus is saying. Okay, I say all that to say a point I want to bring up here. One of the points the book makes that I so appreciate is this. We live in a culture where there is a presumption of atheism. What's the presumption of atheism? The presumption of atheism is this, that if we have no evidence or proof or anything, then you ought to be an atheist. That's called a presumption of atheism. Therefore, the presumption of atheism is the burden of proof. You understand what I mean when I say the burden of proof? Burden of proof is on believers. If you want me to believe in God, you got to prove it to me. Here's the point I want to make. I am happy to prove that to you. But before we go there, I want to make a point before we go to point 2. Point 2 is proving to you that God really exists. But point 1 is this. Why do I have to prove that there's a God and you don't have to prove that there's not a God? Yeah. Now, I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to move to point 2. But before I get there, follow me. Why should there be a presumption of atheism? Why shouldn't there be a presumption of theism? Why shouldn't we all just naturally believe in God until you can prove there's no God? And I tell you what, people don't have an answer for that 9 times out of 10. They just say, well, it just is. And that's where you say, I want to challenge your thinking. Because you're not thinking logically. In fact, you're being a hypocrite, the very thing that they like to charge us with. Do you understand the point I'm trying to make? I'm not afraid to go to the evidence. In fact, I hope none of us are. I think we need to be well prepared for that. But before you go there, don't give up first base. You don't have to give up first base. There's no reason for that. There's no reason for the presumption of atheism. Do you see what Jesus is doing here? He's going to say, I'm going to give you a lot of proof, but before we go there, why do you assume I'm lying? You're making a faulty conclusion. Do you understand how he's challenging their thinking? Okay, so he says, let's think. So he says, even if I do testify on my own behalf, that doesn't preclude truth. Doesn't necessitate that I'm not telling things that are right, because I know where I come from and where I'm going, which, by the way, you guys don't have a faintest idea. You've spouted off so much stuff, and you're wrong on this. You have no idea where I come from and where I'm going. Verse 15. You judge by, okay, my translation says human standards. What does yours say?
According to the flesh.
Good. The word is sarx. Sarx. It just means your body, your appetites. You go with what your body tells you to. It says you judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one. This is so interesting. Because before you finish this text, he's going to come back and say, I'm going to judge you. But he starts off by saying, you know what, the kind of standards you guys use, kind of judgment, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. Again, if you put this in the context, I think the best way to look at this personally is Jesus is really challenging the thinking of the people who are willing to think. Okay, that's not everybody in his crowd, right? The people who are willing to think, he wants to challenge the thinking. The people who are unwilling to think, he wants to undercut their influence they're going to have on other people. So it's at least twofold here that's going to be taking place. So he's pointing out that they're not using wise judgment just by human standards. Verse 16, but if I do judge, my decisions are true. See, he's setting this up. I don't judge the way you guys do, but he is going to talk about judgment later on. If I do judge, my decisions are true because I am not alone. I stand with the Father who sent me. Uh-oh. Well, what's this thing that you started off with? You've got to have more than one witness? Well, he's going to come back to the same place he did before. God stands with me. He's going to prove it again. In your own law, verse 17 is written, the testimony of two witnesses is true. I am one who testifies for myself. The other witness is the Father who sent me. By the way, in what sense and what do you think Jesus is trying to bring to mind when he says the Father witnesses for me too? Okay, we're going to go through the word that God gave. That's going to be indirect. But what's a more direct way that God actually said something like, I don't know, this is my son? That'd be a pretty good witness, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. Do you think that news has traveled around? Do you think other people have heard about his baptism, what's taken place? Do you think people have heard about things he's done in his ministry? I think that news has passed around. I think maybe that's one of the things that Jesus is bringing up. Okay, I think it's more than that. He's consistent with the ministry that God has given him to do. And that's one of the things that Jesus is going to emphasize here. Verse 19, when they ask, where is your Father? Okay, he just got through saying, it's not just me, the Father as well. They probably already know what he means because he said this more than once. He's talking about God, his Father. Why do they respond by saying, where is your Father? I'm asking this question because I don't think it comes out in English very well. This is a put down. Especially in this culture. Remember this culture? It's all about family. Okay? And it's kind of like saying, where's your father? In other words, we don't even think you have a father. And in that culture at that time, that'd be really bad. Right? Okay. To besmirch his birth. You know, maybe your mom wasn't married when you were born. That's kind of what they're bringing up. Where is your Father? You do not know me or my Father, Jesus replied. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. Again, reading from our perspective, this makes total sense, but I want you to see how he builds through these verses. He spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts near the place where the offerings were put, yet no one seized him because his hour had not come. Okay, the very fact, we call this again, this is another place to write down majestic presence, because here again they can't seize him. But what does it imply when it says nobody could seize him? That implies what?
He was right.
Okay, nobody could take him away implies somebody was trying to take him away. Doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay, so he's getting opposition here. When he says these things, don't just think people are sitting around, you know, rubbing their tummy thinking, oh, yeah, that's... No, people are getting agitated. We'll see that a little more clearly in the next few verses here. Verse 21, once more Jesus said, I am going away and you will look for me and you will die in your sin. Where I go, you cannot come. Okay, back in chapter 7, he says, I'm not of this world. He's already made the point that he's not talking about the physical world like they're talking about. Remember, they've already speculated on some of these things that Jesus has said before. But what does Jesus mean by this? Where is he going that they cannot go? Yeah, to the cross, and as a result of the cross, he's going to ascend back to the Father, right? And have a relationship with God. I think what he's referring to here, when he's saying, you will die in your sin, you won't have a relationship with the Father. You're not going to end up the same place I'm going to end up. And why? Because you're rejecting me. Verse 22, this made the Jews ask, and when we refer to Jews, remember you can call the crowds the Jews or religious leaders. Usually the term Jews refers to, I got to be careful here, but usually opposition.
Yes.
Opposition, right? They ask him, will he kill himself? Is that why he says, where I go you cannot come? Okay. Were they sincere in asking this question? Maybe. But if these guys are in opposition, and it just said just a couple verses ago that they couldn't take them away, right? And they're asking this sort of question, isn't it possible that they're asking this, they're saying this as another opportunity to try to sling mud, to cast aspersions, so to speak? Is this guy going to commit suicide? Say something else negative about Jesus, try to plant negative thoughts in people's minds? I think that's probably what's going on. Verse 23, but he continued, you are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. He's already talked about that back in chapter 7. In fact, who did he say that to? Who did he say, you're of this world? Who was he talking to? The first 5 verses.
Pharisees?
No. Okay, I'll give you their names. Joseph, James, Jude,
his brothers.
Simon, his brothers. Told his brothers, because his brothers didn't believe him, and he said, you're of this world. Okay, verse 24, I told you that you would die in your sins if you do not believe. If you do not believe, what's the phrase he uses here? I am. Okay, again, as many times as Jesus uses this, the way he uses this, he's going to use it again in verse 28 and in verse 58. You're going to die in your sins if you do not believe, I am he. You will indeed die in your sins. He's pointing to the fact that not just that you reject me, you need me. You won't have life if you reject me. Who are you, they asked, verse 25. Just what I have been telling you from the beginning, Jesus replied. I have much to say in judgment of you. Wait a minute, I just thought he said a little bit earlier, I don't judge. Okay, he said, I don't judge the way you judge, but I do have something to say in judgment of you. And part of his judgment here is because he represents God's truth. Okay, what I've been telling you from the beginning, Jesus replied, I have much to say in judgment of you, but he who sent me is trustworthy, and what I have heard from him, I tell the world. They did not understand what he was telling them about his Father. They're not catching on that he's talking about his relationship with God, that he's the Son of God. So Jesus said, this is verse 28, when you have lifted up, notice he says, they're not catching on, so Jesus keeps going. And since they're not catching on, he says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know. Okay, we've seen this before back in chapter 3. We're going to see it again over in chapter 12. What does Jesus mean when he says, when you've lifted the Son of Man up? The cross. By the way, we know he's talking about the cross because in chapter 12 when he says this, let me give you the verse. Verses 32 and 33. In chapter 12, verse 32 and 33, here's what it says. When I am lifted up, I'll draw men unto myself. That's verse 32. Verse 33, by saying this, he meant being put on the cross. So we know he's talking about the cross because it says he was talking about the cross. Right? Okay, why do I want to emphasize that? Not only because it's there, but this phrase, being lifted up, also means to be exalted. It's the exact same words. It means to be exalted, but catch this. He makes it clear over in chapter 12 that he's talking about being put up on the cross. By being put up on the cross, he is exalted. Because that's what he came to do. He's accomplishing his task, right? So it has a double meaning. He's lifted up on the cross and he's exalted. He's accomplished what he came to do by dying on that cross. Okay, so he's answering their question. They don't understand his connection with God. So to answer that, he says, when you lift up the Son of Man, you will know that, he's using that word again, that I am. In other words, it's going to prove my relationship with God. It's going to prove my divinity. You will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own, but speak just as the Father has taught me. You're going to see this is all part of God's plan. By the way, before the fact, almost nobody saw it. It wasn't until after the fact that it all fit together and they all saw. Verse 29, the one who sent me is with me and has not left me alone, for I always do what pleases him. By the way, 4 different times in this one discussion here, 4 different times, he says it's the Father who sent me, the one who sent me, my Father. So he's saying, I'm not just doing this on my own. I'm completing a mission that God's given me to complete. Verse 30, even as he spoke, Okay, focus with me here. Verse 30. Even as he spoke, so he's saying these things and gives this explanation. It says, even as he spoke, many believed in him. Okay, what kind of impact is he having? Is he swaying some of the people?
Yes.
Okay, some people are starting to think. So it's number one, we can say it's definitely polarizing, because some people are getting so hot and bothered they're trying to take him away, but they can't. In fact, at the end of the chapter, they're going to try to stone him, but they can't. And other people are believing. Okay, that's point one. Point two, when you use this word believing, what does that mean? Well, James says even
Demons.
yeah, even demons believe. So he's having a different impact on different people, but just because it says some are believing, does that mean they're ready to follow him? I don't think so, because that's not what's going to happen. It seems like everybody's going to be against him, but some are believing him. But just because they believe him doesn't mean they're ready to follow him. Does that make sense? Okay, by the way, does that make you even more guilty? If you're against somebody, but you know they're right, but you're still against them? Yeah, I think it does. So is all this that Jesus is saying, is it having an impact? Is it having yeah, it is. And some people are catching up. Some people are starting to think. Doesn't mean they're changing the way they live. Doesn't mean they repent. But they're thinking, right? Okay. Many believe, that's verse 30. Verse 31. To the Jews who had believed. Okay, now catch this. Who's he talking to? The people who believe. By the way, how does he describe them? He uses the term Jews. Okay, if what I've said is right so far, every time we read the word Jews, we usually think of people who are not for him. Okay, how could people not be for him and still believe him? Well, are demons for Jesus or against Jesus? No, but James chapter 2 says demons believe, but they're scared to death. Okay, I think that's what well, you come to your own conclusion here, but look what it says. So those Jews who believed, here's what Jesus says to them. If you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, wait a minute. If they already believe, but let me just go ahead and state this. Jesus doesn't say, great, you believe, that's all I want. No. He says, if you believe, then take the next step. The next step is obey. Yeah, do what I say to do. So it's kind of like, okay, you're starting to, things are starting to click in your head. Now act consistently with it. Are they? No, they're not. No, they're not. In fact, this very challenge for them to know the truth, and the truth will set them free. How do they respond to this? Verse 33. This is one of my favorite verses for an odd reason here. But look at verse 33. They answered him, we are Abraham's descendants. We've never been slaves of anyone. Okay. Thank you for laughing. How many years were they in Egypt?
400 or something?
Yeah, okay. What happened with this Babylonian empire? Yeah, where'd they take? Period of judges with cycles of 6 what? Oppressions. By the way, what's Rome right now? Have these guys ever been free? For short periods, yeah, they were free. But most of the time they were slaves. But when Jesus says you'll set free we've never been slaves. Doesn't this sound like, haven't they said this a couple times before? Haven't they said, it took 46 years just to build the proper part of the temple? Well, no, you misspoke. It's the whole temple. What did they say back in chapter 7? That, I forget. What was the, look to it. And by the way, this is a religious leader saying this. No prophet ever came from Galilee. Well, yeah, there were some prophets from Galilee. Sometimes you get so emotional, though, you just make some statements that, that's just not true. Yeah, don't bother me with the facts. I just feel this passionately, right? Well, I find this such a humorous statement. Anyway, they said, we've never been slaves of anyone. How can you say, shall be set free? Okay, who does Jesus speak to? The Jews who believed. Okay, this tells me this is not a quality belief, and belief's not the whole basket, is it? Because to those guys, he says, you need more, and their response is, no, we don't. We've not been slaves to anybody. How can you say we're going to be set free? Jesus replied, verily, truly, again, please underline that. That means this is a solemn statement. This is so important. Amen, amen. I tell you, everyone who sins, by the way, who sins? Everybody. So everybody who sins is a slave to sin. Okay, they're making a political statement, and Jesus is going to take it even deeper. Not only have you guys been in bondage in Egypt and Babylon and Assyria and the Romans and the Greeks in between and all that other stuff, everybody's a slave to sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. Okay, he's saying, you guys are sinners. As sinners, it makes you slaves. Only a son really belongs. By the way, who's the only son here?
Yes.
He's saying, I'm the only one who's not a slave. All you guys are slaves. Yes.
There's something I'm curious about.
Yes.
It says, in their sin, they're slaves, and I have a footnote that says bondservant, which my understanding of bondservant is like, that's usually like a willing slave, right?
Sold and slave.
Yeah, and there might be some connotation to that, but the word used here can be translated either way. It's doulos,
Oh, okay.
slave or servant. But remember Romans chapter 7, you're a slave to whoever you choose to follow. Yeah, yeah. Good point though, because there's a lot of connotation to this. But he's just saying you are in bondage because you serve sin, because you are a sinner. He says, but I'm not. So he's making a contrast between himself and the rest of them. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. He's saying there is a possibility for you to take care of your problem. And it's me. You know, and he's saying this to the people who believe in him, and he's challenging them, come on. And they're resisting. In fact, they're more than resisting. They're going to go the opposite direction. Verse 37, I know that you are Abraham's descendants. By the way, John the Baptist said that too, right? You're Abraham's descendants. And what else did he say? God could make these rocks Abraham's descendants. Don't think that you have a good relationship with God just because you're Abraham's descendants. Which, by the way, is the very point. Because they think if we're Abraham's descendants, then we're in with God. And what's the point he's making here? No, you're not. I know you're Abraham's descendants, but he just got through saying you're sinners and you're slaves to sin. So, are they saved?
No.
No. Who's he talking to?
The Jews.
Why didn't some Baptist preacher set Jesus straight and tell him all Jews are going to be saved? Sorry. Didn't mean to say Baptist preacher. I just meant to say modern preacher. So many people think the Jews are automatically in. Jesus didn't get that memo. Did he? Isn't he saying they're lost? I tell you, I just shake my head at this concept that all Israel will be saved if you understand what God's Israel is. Because the same book, where does that say all Israel will be saved? Book of Romans, the same book says not all Israel is Israel. Not all Jews are really God's Jews. Galatians 3, 27 through 29 tells us who's Abraham's real descendants are. Who are they? Those who have been baptized into Christ and put on Christ. Doesn't make any difference if you're a Jew or a Gentile. Man or a woman, a slave or free. Those are the ones who are really Abraham's descendants. Okay, let's come back to this. We've only got a few minutes left. I know you're Abraham's descendants physically, right? I know you're Abraham's descendants. You are looking for a way to kill me. Okay, why is he pointing that out? Because you're not living like Abraham's descendants. Let me just come right out public with this and state what I know you guys are thinking. By the way, did the crowd already know this? Remember chapter 7? Yes. Some of the crowd said, hey, isn't this the guy they're trying to kill?
Yeah.
So they know that, right? You're looking for a way to kill me because you have no room for my word. I'm telling you what I've seen in the Father's presence, and you are doing what you have heard from your Father. Oh boy, Jesus is going to take this one step further, isn't he? By the way, who's he saying this to? The people who believed in him. Well, they were believing, but not the right kind of belief, right? Okay, you're listening to your father. Abraham is our father, they answered. If you were Abraham's children, Jesus replied, then you would do as Abraham did. Doesn't this sound like chapter 5 where he says, if you really like Moses, if you really follow Moses, you'd be listening to me. Okay, he's going to say the same thing about Abraham here. He says, if you're really his children, you would do what Abraham did. Not only that, look what he's going to say in the next verse. He says, as it is, you're looking for a way to kill me. That's not consistent with living like a true son of Abraham. A man who told you the truth that I heard from God. Abraham did not do such things. You are doing the works of your father. We are not illegitimate children, they protested. The only father we have is God himself. See, they're going back from Abraham saying we have a connection with God because we're descendants of Abraham, right? And Jesus is, again, going to run counter to that. He says, Jesus says it, this verse 42, Jesus said to them, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I have come here from God. I have not come on my own, God has sent me. Why is my language not clear to you? Okay, Phil, what does yours say? Is my language not clear to you? Verse 43.
I have not even come with my own initiative, but he who sent me.
That's verse 43.
Why do you not understand?
Why do you not understand what I'm saying?
Okay, why do you not understand? Mine says, why don't you make clear? The word here is literally gnosko. In other words, it's knowledge that comes through experience. And he's saying, why isn't your... In other words, what he's saying is, why aren't you putting two and two together? I've given you several pieces of evidence. By the way, the evidence he's given in chapter 5 and chapter 7 is logical evidence. What other evidence has he given? How about miracles?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you could take all the pieces of evidence, but he's saying, think, guys, think. Come on, let's reason this through. And he's saying, you're not doing this. Why aren't you thinking, is in essence what he's saying. Because you're unable to hear what I say. Verse 44, you belong to your father, and now he finally tells them who their father is. Who's their father?
The devil.
The devil. And you want to carry out your father's desires. He's a murderer from the beginning, not holding the truth, for there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his natural language, his native language, for he's a liar and the father of lies. Boy, he doesn't just say, hey, you're acting like Satan. No, your father is Satan. He's a liar from the beginning. When he lies, it's just his natural language. Jesus has thrown him under the bus, the big bus here. Right? Verse 45, yet because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Can any of you prove? Okay, going to give another logical response here. Can you give me proof that I'm guilty of any sin? By the way, no human being could ever say that. Purely human being. Only the God human could say that. Can you prove me guilty of any sin? No, you can't. If I'm telling you the truth, why don't you believe me? Whoever belongs to God hears what God says. The reason you do not hear is that you do not belong to God. Okay, I'm going to stop right there, but I want you to get the connection between, we'll come back, verse 48 here. You are, you may have been born into a certain family, but you know who your father is? It's who you act like. It's who you act like. And if you want to claim Abraham for your father, then you better act like Abraham did. Abraham trusted, by the way, we're in the middle of this argument. He's going to come back and say, you know what? Abraham rejoiced in my day. He was looking forward to me coming. And you guys reject me. You're acting consistent with your father. Your father is father of lies. Now, why would he say that? Are they lying to anybody? Yeah, can you think of one of the lies? We're not trying to kill him, but we're trying to kill him. Right? Maybe, I've often heard this said, and maybe this is part of it. Worst person in the world to lie to is yourself. Yourself. Okay, no doubt they've told a lot of lies, but maybe one of the things he's trying to get them to see is you're lying to yourself. So he's bringing some of these things to the surface so they'll at least think about it. Okay, I wish we could have finished this in one chunk tonight because it's a beautiful, the way this passage fits together. I was trying to cover more ground so we could see it, but we'll back up just a little bit to try to fit this together because it's a beautiful, logical argument. It comes back to this idea, you know what, you ought to think consistently because the better you think, the more you're going to come to God's side because all truth is God's truth. Should never be afraid to think. Should never be able to fear pursuing the truth. The truth is going to lead us to God. So, any questions, comments? I know I had to blow by some of this kind of quick. Let's pray.